Valentine's Day as well, if that means anything to you, matters to you. I am delighted to be here. I don't know if this is your first time at one of these talks, or whether you've been coming to a few different talks during the week. But we're going to look at the question of do dead people rise? And this is something that has been close to my heart, close to my own story, which I'll say a little bit more about as we go along. But I first of all wanted to mention, most of you haven't graduated yet, some of you maybe have if you're postgrads, but when you graduate, you become an alumni. Alumnus, and you get a magazine from your university, and in the back, from Bristol was my university, and I was there a long time ago. But every time I get the magazine, I look in the back, and just it has a list of who's died recently, and so I look and see if there are any of my old professors or lecturers. And one time, I think it was 2012, I saw this written down. It said, due to an administrative error, the death of Mr. F, BA, graduated 1956, was mistakenly announced in the autumn 2012 edition of Nonsuch. He is in fact alive and well, and we apologise for any concern caused. So I thought that was quite interesting. I took note of that. And it sort of struck me that this is essentially the belief that lies at the heart of the Christian faith, of a man, Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus Christ, who was killed by Roman crucifixion. He was executed quite brutally. He was placed in a tomb, and he was thought to be dead. But then Christians are saying it turns out not. He's actually alive and well and at work in the world, and not due to an administrative error, but actually because he has risen from the grave. And so what should we make of this? What should we make of this? Is it true? Or are Christians mistaken, or are they just sort of believing in something that's a little bit far-fetched, a little bit too good to be true? It's really important that we think about this, because if Jesus did rise from the grave, it actually changes everything. It's not just a case of, well, that's nice for you. If Jesus rose from the dead, and he actually said that anyone that follows him, the same will be true of them, then that's not just a case of my truth, your truth. That's either true for all of us, or it's true for none of us. But if he didn't rise from the dead, then Christians are wasting their time. These events are pointless, and maybe we're even deluded. And so it's really important that we think about this question. But before I get into the resurrection itself, there's a wider question about miracles in general. A lot of people think, don't miracles contradict the laws of nature? Some of this thinking is coming from the Scottish philosopher David Hume, who described miracles as violations of the laws of nature, and the laws of nature as principles that cannot be violated. Now, apart from the fact that this is circular reasoning and actually doesn't represent a cogent argument, is it the case that miracles are violations of the laws of nature? What are the laws of nature? Well, I want to start by throwing out some chocolate for you, because it's Valentine's Day, and so we all need chocolate on Valentine's Day. So, anyone want some? Anyone at the back there? Terrible thrower, sorry. I'm going to have to lean in a bit. There's actually quite a few in here. I'm happy to empty the box. Another one at the back there. Sorry. I've still got a good few here, so sorry. I'm known for my box skills, sorry. Okay, another one. Right, I've got 5 more left. Okay, so much fun here. Yes. Is it there? Sorry. Terrible. Right. Okay, one more. Who's getting the last one? Right, I've emptied the box. No describe the transit of that chocolate through the air. So the laws of nature are descriptive, but they're not prescriptive. Just because the laws of nature describe the transit of that chocolate through the air doesn't mean you can't reach out your hand and intercept it and set it on a completely different trajectory. You see, the laws of nature, they actually are probabilistic. They're not fixed certainties. They describe what happens 99.99% of the time. But that doesn't mean that occasionally something else can't happen. They describe what normally happens, but doesn't mean something else can't happen on occasion. And it was C.S. Lewis that made the point that actually the laws of nature expose a miracle, they don't contradict it. And he uses this example. Imagine you put £30 in your college drawer. I know no one deals in cash anymore, but just go with me on this one anyway. You put £30 in your drawer, and then you go out for the day, and you come back, and there's only £10 in there. What do you conclude? Do you conclude that the laws of mathematics have been broken? Or do you conclude that the laws of England have been broken? It's precisely because the laws of mathematics are fixed and stable that you can identify another possibility that somebody else has come in and done something and has intervened. And so actually the laws of nature do not contradict miracles, they actually expose it. You need the normal in order to identify the paranormal. You need to know the natural in order to identify the supernatural. And the people that claim that they've seen Jesus rise from the dead were saying, look, it's because people don't normally get up from their graves and walk again, that we can identify the resurrection of Jesus as being absolutely unique in the whole of history. And so it is not the case that miracles are violations of the laws of nature. The question to be asking is, does God exist? That's the question that lies at the heart of this, because if God exists, he would be capable of inventing laws that science can uncover and describe beautifully, and occasionally suspend those laws to intervene and do something extraordinary. And if he did that, it wouldn't be because he likes meddling with nature, but because he has good reason to do that, to intervene in our lives, to come be with us, to rescue us, and to do for us what we can't do for ourselves. So how do we establish whether or not the resurrection happened? Well, the philosopher and historian Gary Habermas has developed what's known as a minimal facts approach. And he advocates for examining the resurrection using facts that are widely accepted by scholars. It doesn't require you to believe that the Bible is the inspired word of God. It doesn't require you to believe the Bible is inerrant, although that's what Christians do believe. But historians take these documents as historical manuscripts, and on that basis they develop this minimal facts approach. So what are those minimal facts? Number one, Jesus died by crucifixion. All scholars in this field agree that Jesus really existed and he died. The only thing they don't agree on is whether he rose from the dead. Number two, Jesus' disciples had experiences that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. They were convinced that they'd seen Jesus alive. Number three, as a result of that, the disciples were transformed into bold people who were willing to die for their beliefs. And number four, two former skeptics became believers after their own personal encounter with the risen Jesus. And those two people were James, the brother of Jesus, someone from the same family as him, and Saul of Tarsus, who is known for his Damascus Road encounter with the risen Christ, who became the Apostle Paul later on. And and so what we want to ask is employ the scientific approach of what is the inference to the best explanation. You know, when you're trying to come up with how to interpret scientific data, you've got a number of options. And then we're wanting to ask, what is the inference to the best explanation? So I want to take these minimal facts one by one and examine an objection that is raised to that fact. So firstly, number one, that Jesus died by crucifixion. So one of the objections raised is, well, maybe Jesus didn't actually die. Maybe he didn't die. Maybe he managed to feign death and then revive himself in the tomb and somehow get out of the tomb and appear to the disciples. And because he was a bit pale from his experiences, they thought he was risen. And then he went away and quietly died of his wounds. Well, in response to this objection, the vast majority of historical scholars, even if they're not believers, they all agree that Jesus definitely died. And there are a number of reasons for that. There's overwhelming evidence for this. The first reason is the Romans were very good at executing people. Jesus could easily have died during flogging. I don't know if you've seen the film The Passion of the Christ, where you see what it means even just to be flogged before you carry the cross up the hill and are crucified, that you're actually whipped with something that has bits of bone and metal and it rips out part of your flesh as well as marking the skin. It's not uncommon to die during that process. But of course, on the cross, Jesus was nailed through the hands and feet, and what you end up dying of is asphyxiation because you can't breathe. And to speed up death if people are taking too long, and by too long we normally mean a day or two or three, sometimes a week, they break your ankles so that you can't press yourself up anymore to try and get air into your lungs. And when they came to Jesus just 6 hours after he'd been put up on the cross, they discovered he was already dead, and so they didn't break his ankles. So that was already a clear sign that the people examining him were convinced he'd already died. But just to make sure, they pierced his side. They sent a spear through his chest cavity, which went through the pericardium into the heart. Now, the pericardium contains a little bit of water, and the historical accounts say there was a flow of blood and water, a serum. And that was also an indicator that blood clotting had started to occur. The fact that these two things had separated. This is a medical sign of death that physicians would advocate today. So there's actually no question that Jesus died. And if the crucifixion hadn't finished him off, then the preparation for burial certainly would have done. You are covered in vast quantities of spices and wrapped in very tightly bound bandages. Jesus would have had to have somehow unwrapped himself from all of these before even moving the stone, and that, again, is an impossible feat. But even more importantly than all of that, a half-dead Jesus that is bleeding and kind of reeling from this horrific torture and execution that he's been through would surely have not succeeded in inspiring his disciples to believe that he was their risen Lord, risen in a new dimension, about to do something extraordinary. Surely it would have taken a bit more than that to inspire them to then go on to be people who boldly proclaimed that they'd seen their risen rabbi and to oversee this new movement, the birth of the church. So the argument that Jesus didn't die has not stood up to scrutiny. What about the second one, that Jesus' disciples had experiences that they thought were appearances of the risen Jesus? Well, an objection raised sometimes to this one is that the disciples were hallucinating. Maybe they thought they'd seen the risen Jesus, but actually it was just sort of in their mind. The problem with the hallucination objection is that hallucinations are essentially private events. And what we know is actually that Jesus appeared to over 500 people over a 40-day period. And he appeared in lots of different kinds of settings. He met a woman in a garden. He met some people by a lake. There were a group of them in a room by themselves. And so there's a lot of, the appearances are incredibly varied. and they often involve multiple people, and mass hallucination is not a thing. It's actually a very private, very individual event, so it's hard to see how every single person could have been hallucinating. Also, hallucinations, they often occur on and off over a long period of time, often a lifetime, whereas the resurrection appearance as Jesus happened very intensively for 40 days, and then they stopped. And so the idea of a hallucination doesn't stand up to scrutiny either. What about minimal fact number 3, that as a result the disciples were transformed into bold witnesses who were willing to die for their beliefs? Well, an objection raised to this is, well, what if they'd actually stolen the body and invented the story and just kind of made it up? Well, that raises the question, why? Why would you do that? Why would you actually make up a story like that for its own sake, especially when it's bringing you so much trouble from the Roman authorities? It doesn't really explain the passion and the zeal and the change in the disciples. My husband became a Christian at about your age, similar to me. We didn't know each other at the time. And this was the piece of evidence that convinced him. Like, why would you die for a lie? They went on, every single follower of Jesus in that core group went on to die for what they believed. Actually, some of them had a worse death, even physically speaking, than Jesus. Peter was crucified upside down. Why would you do that unless you were absolutely convinced that this had really happened? There was something about the change in the disciples. And finally, what about the fact that 2 former skeptics became believers? Minimal fact number 4. 2 former skeptics became believers after their own personal experiences with the risen Jesus. James, the brother of Jesus, and Saul of Tarsus. And an objection raised to this is that, well, all the people who said they saw Jesus already believed in him. All the people that are saying they've seen him alive, they already believed in him, so are they not actually biased? But I think that the thing that this point is making is that James, the brother of Jesus, didn't believe in him as being the Christ, and neither did Saul of Tarsus. In fact, Saul of Tarsus was a persecutor of Christians, someone that was very zealous about his traditional views. And actually, when he encountered Jesus, he was on his way to imprison a set of Christians. And he was actually present at the death of the first Christian martyr, Saint Stephen. These 2 people were not believers in the risen Christ at the time that they saw him. And also, a half-dead Jesus or a lie or a fabrication would not have been enough to convince these skeptics either that Jesus had really risen. And so these are some minimal facts. And there are actually many other. There's a whole series of facts. I've just given you some core ones. There are lots of other objections that could be raised as well. Maybe they went to the wrong tomb. Maybe Jesus was in a different tomb, or maybe the grave was robbed and someone else stole the body. There are lots of other objections that we can look at. But it remains a credible option that Jesus really did rise from the dead. And the theologian N.T. Wright says this: "I've examined all the alternate explanations, ancient and modern, for the rise of the early church, and I have to say that far and away the best historical explanation is that Jesus of Nazareth really did rise from the dead." And there are a number of philosophers and lawyers, journalists, scientists, and detectives who've become convinced of the validity of the resurrection, often from a starting point of looking at the evidence with the aim of disproving it, with the aim of discounting it. And they've ended up changing their minds. One interesting person in this regard is the philosopher Antony Flew. English philosopher. He died in 2010. But in 1985, he debated Gary Habermas, this minimal facts guy, on the resurrection in front of an audience of 3,000 people in the States at Liberty University. And this began a friendship. Over the next 20 years, Gary Habermas and Anthony Flew became really good friends, and they met many more times privately and had phone calls and so on. They debated each other publicly 2 more times, in April 2000 and in January 2003. And shortly after their 2003 debate, Flew gave Habermas a call to say, actually, I'm going to become a theist. He didn't become a Christian, but he changed his views from believing God did not exist to believing there was some kind of God. And he did it on the basis of the resurrection. And he said this: the evidence for the resurrection is better than for any claimed miracles in any other religion. It's outstandingly different in quality and quantity, I think, from the evidence offered for the occurrence of most other supposedly miraculous events. He was entirely convinced that this was valid and held water. Or we could look at someone called Lee Strobel, who was an award-winning Chicago Tribune journalist, highly skeptical, but his wife had become a Christian, and she started kind of talking to him about her beliefs. And so he set out to disprove the resurrection. He did it by interviewing lots of people, like pathologists, about how you declare someone dead, and what does it mean to be crucified, and how can we trust what we're reading. And he ended up, again, becoming persuaded that the only logical explanation was that Jesus rose. And he said this: he's got a book called The Case for Christ, which was one of many books that he's written. This has now been converted into a movie on Netflix, which you can see if you've got Netflix, called The Case for Christ. He says this: I didn't become a Christian because God promised I would have an even happier life than I had as an atheist. He never promised any such thing. I became a Christian because the evidence was so compelling that Jesus really is the one and only Son of God, who proved his divinity by rising from the dead. And that meant that following him was the most rational and logical step I could possibly take. And that's just 2 of many people who have changed their views as a result of looking in to the evidence. I said earlier in the week, I'm from a scientific background. I spent over a decade in brain imaging. And, you know, at the heart of being a good scientist is the need to be open to new ideas, right? Because if you design an experiment, you've got a hypothesis of what you expect to happen. And then you collect data. And then you have to examine that data and see if it matches up with your initial starting hypothesis. And if it does, great, you're onto the right thing. If it doesn't, you have to come back and consider the possibility you might have got the starting hypothesis wrong. But you have to be open to that process in order to let science take its natural course. And any hindrance to that can hinder the course of science. And actually, we've seen that through history. So I want to ask you this question. Are you open to the possibility that the death barrier might have been defeated? Are you open to the possibility that one person in history has actually defeated death? Because if it's true, it actually changes everything. It's not just relevant for this person or that person. It's not even just dependent on our feelings. It's like, you know, it's really nice for you. I wish I could have your faith. I wish I could muster up all of that sense of belief in something. The Christian faith actually rests on history. Either this happened or it didn't. And our choice is, are we convinced that it has happened? And you know, it says in one letter to the church in Rome, it says, if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. It's not about mustering up and trying to will things into being. It's like, do I believe Jesus was risen or not? But here's a question. Why does it matter? What does it mean? Even if he did. It actually means quite a lot. It actually means that, you see, if you were to pick up the biographies of Jesus' life, and there's a copy on this chair, on the tables in front of you, it talks about all the things Jesus did and all the things that he said. If he actually did rise from the dead, it means you can trust everything else that's in there as well, because he said, I'm going to die and I'm going to rise. And if he actually did go on to do that, you can actually trust not only that, but every other word out of his mouth, every other action. Jesus is trustworthy. It's been my experience after turning to Christ at the age of 20. There is no one else more trustworthy, more who has your back in this messy world than the person of Jesus. Not easy to follow him, but he is actually who he said he is. He can be trusted. Secondly, it means that dead people do rise. It means that death isn't just the end. And it's not just that there's one person that's done it. It's that Jesus is the forerunner on behalf of all of us. He's smashed the death barrier, and all that follow him, the same will be true of them. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me will live, even though they die. And that's an extraordinary thing, if it's true. And it also means, finally, that it actually means that life is available now. To be a Christian is not to buy some sort of ticket to some celestial theme park when you die. Actually, when Jesus walked the earth, he said, the kingdom of heaven has come near. The kingdom of heaven has broken in. And actually, to be a Christian is to invite, in a sense, that kingdom of heaven, the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of Jesus, into your life, into your heart. And what that does is bring dead things to life here and now as well. And that can happen in very dramatic ways. I've got friends that were delivered of kind of drug addictions, broken relationships being sorted out. For some people, it's actually the resurrection of Jesus coming to bear in someone's life can be very dramatic, very real, and it's in the here and now. It's actually in Oxford in 2025 on the 14th of February. And see, to be a Christian is actually Jesus says, look, this is eternal life, that you may know God and Jesus whom he has sent. Eternal life starts now, and it continues through death, through the grave. And for me, I want to say that, I don't know, it was much more ordinary for me, the difference that Jesus made when I turned to him about halfway through a biochemistry degree. Actually, for me, it was, I said earlier in the week that I dated a very ardent atheist, and his views kind of became absorbed into mine. It was just easier that way, and it wasn't until that relationship ended that I had time to think, what do I actually believe? And breakups had always been really hard for me. That was just something I never did very well. And I remember after I'd become a Christian, bumping into him about 6 months later, and actually I didn't have that kind of angst that I usually felt after a breakup. It's like God had given me peace. He'd given me the ability to manage it. And it was much more ordinary. It wasn't very dramatic. But I was actually surprised. I wasn't expecting God to make that sort of difference in my life. And for you, who knows what it would be? Who knows what it would look like? But I want to ask you today, what does it mean for you? Are you open to the possibility that Jesus has risen? And he's actually alive and well. He's at work in the world, and he wants to be at work in your life.